Hey everybody. Yeah, so I am really appreciated all of Ravin's work in this book club and just putting together just all the effort he's put into it. So I just was hoping, to go through this chapter and maybe have, at least kind of facilitate a discussion if that is what works for everybody. And it's a little bit easier to do that, talking on a Zoom call than trying to chat in YouTube. Although YouTube chat is great, but so that's just kind of the idea. So I have put together like a little slide deck to kind of facilitate working through the chapter. And if anyone has any comments or questions while we go through it, please just speak up. There's chat, on Zoom, and there's also you can just unmute yourself and say whatever you want to say. But yeah, pretty excited. It'd be a lot of fun. I do like the difference in differences chapter. That was a very interesting chapter. Lots of thoughts and ideas. So I will pull up my slide deck really quick. And let's see here. Going to your oops, did that wrong. All right. So this is kind of a long chapter, but I thought it was a really good one. Just doing differences and differences, going through kind of the initial format. So we are doing a new format to try and see just a Zoom call to help with the, like I said, facilitating discussion. So if anyone has any feedback, or we're just kind of trying out a new style. So if anyone has any feedback or any ideas or suggestions on how to improve, it'd be great to hear. We're going to go through a chapter overview. And then at the end of the chapter, we can kind of discuss. There was some interesting reading about, the future of diff and diff. And we can also talk about we are getting close to the end of this book. So if people have any thoughts about another book to do, that would be great. I've been really enjoying this book club a lot, so it'd be fun to keep going. So we'll just skip right ahead to the chapter overview. So here we go. So we'll first start off going through this kind of standard what he calls a 2x2 diff and diff. You basically have two groups, two time periods, and one treatment. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty robust and pretty interesting how it kind of all got together. Then after that, there's the importance of placebos and diff and diff, kind of like how to kind of make diff and diff more robust. And then we'll go through the two-way fixed effects with differential timing, which is kind of how to extend the initial diff and diff thing to more complicated scenarios and kind of the pitfalls that kind of come about from that. And this is this figure I thought was most interesting in the chapter. It kind of comes later in the chapter, and it kind of points out some of the issues when you're trying to when you don't have a very straightforward diff and diff scenario, kind of the caveats and issues that come about from trying to do that. And especially the third graph right here becomes the late versus early group can be kind of problematic, but I think it's very interesting, like trying to take these concepts and theories and really apply them in the real world to much more complicated scenarios. So that works really well. It is nice. I went through the chapter, and then kind of going back to it, you kind of get in the weeds, and you kind of see all the caveats and all the possible issues with the errors, whatever. But I really like this quote when I went back to the beginning. It says, this is the most popular research design in quantitative social sciences, and therefore this is really why this is one of the really, it's a strong way of trying to infer causality, and it is very important. So it's very important to kind of go through and understand what's going on with diff and diff, because it is so widely prevalent and so widely used and has been around for a very long time. So this kind of quote helped me kind of realize why, even with its issues, why it's so important to kind of understand it. So we'll start with the standard kind of where diff and diff originated. Just start out with John Snow in the 1800s, I think it was. It was about 80 years before any sort of idea of randomized testing kind of came about. So the initial idea is Jon Snow is trying to figure out cholera, and at the time they thought cholera was passed by poisonous gas or miasma, and Jon Snow thought it might be actually from waterborne, that it was waterborne. So during that time, they used to dump raw sewage into the Thames in London, and then they would pull water for drinking water below downriver from the sewage output, and so they're drinking sewage water, and that was probably where the cholera was coming from. So they changed the rules, and one company started pulling the water above the sewage drop, upriver from the sewage area, and that was Lambeth. And then, but Southwark and Vauxhall, so it was still pulling sewage from pulling drinking water from below the sewage output. So, if you were to just take the difference between the cholera outbreak in 1849 and 1854 from Lambeth, you wouldn't be able to accommodate for any other possible causes. Whereas if you're trying to also if you use the company from Southwark, you're trying to use that as a type of quasi-control. So even though Lambeth, customers of the Lambeth company getting their drinking water from Lambeth and customers from Southwark they aren't a randomized sample, but they are some sort of way of trying to control for the two effects. So if you were to when you just take the difference of the two outbreaks for Lambeth, you get the top part here. So you have, when you take the difference for those, you have both the treatment D effect and T, the time or trend effect. So there are multiple things that could be going on just from taking that difference. And if you take the Southwark difference, then you have just the treatment or trend, just the time or trend effect. So when you take the difference from both of them, you then get out the treatment effect. So looking at the equation down here, you have basically you're assuming that this y to the naught sub k is the counterfactual. This is what the treated group would be like if it had not been treated. And so this is the average treatment effect for the treated, and then this will actually work out if this non-parallel trends bias is 0. So with Lambeth and Southwark, this is just 85 minus 19, and then 135 minus 147, and then you subtract both those, and you get a treatment effect of 78. So this kind of shows a causality or infers a causality between where you're pulling the water sources from, and that therefore showed that cholera is actually spread by water and not by a poisonous gas. But the only reason this works is when this parallel trends bias goes to 0. So you are assuming that both observed and unobserved trends in the Lambeth group are the same as the Southwark group. And so that is kind of the key point. It also goes back, we'll look at that a little bit later, but it does also go back to the DAG from the panels chapter, in that these two groups are not affecting each other. So they're both kind of independent groups that are going through the treatment and non-treatment situation. That's the basis of a kind of classic 2x2. You have two groups. You have a pre-treatment period, you have a post-treatment period, and then you can just kind of brute force, just take the differences between the two groups and then between the two time periods. And that is the basic diff and diff situation. Then Scott gives the example of changing the minimum wage between Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And what's really important about this is you can take the standard diff and diff approach and then convert it into a regression formula. And with the regression formula, you can then start doing uncertainty analysis, and you can have an idea. You can start using all the different tools in econometrics and other things for using linear regression. And these are just dummy variables for if you are in New Jersey or in Pennsylvania, the treatment group. And then in order to kind of convert this, you have to assume a constant state effect and a constant time fixed effect. And then you're able to kind of, with this what was surprising about this study was that there was the assumption that when you increase minimum wage, that would decrease employment. And so they took New Jersey, I thought Pennsylvania was, Pennsylvania was the control group and New Jersey was the treatment group. And then they basically looked at the change during the treatment when they changed the minimum wage. And so going through this linear regression, you can see that let's see, you go from the control group, which is just the New Jersey Post, New Jersey, yeah. So at the top here, you have the change in, let's see, I believe it's Pennsylvania, and then post-treatment, which is the untreated group of Pennsylvania, and then this is New Jersey, and then assuming that there's a common trend between these two, you would assume that the counterfactual, the one that is unobserved, is New Jersey if it were not treated. This is New Jersey as it actually is when it is treated, and then this is the treatment effect here, delta. And so they're able to show kind of a surprising result in that despite raising the minimum wage, they actually had an increase or not a significant decrease in employment. So these two things are kind of incredible as far as like trying to determine causality. And it is just very straightforward. So there are, two groups, a pre-treatment period, a post-treatment period, and then a kind of a very robust finding, assuming that there is the parallel trends assumption holds. And yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I also like the idea of like in this example, it's a really nice, clear, just a 6-month period. Like if you were to kind of take this example and then run it for a longer period of time, you'd then kind of run into like whether New Jersey and Pennsylvania are interacting with each other. Because like with the I should have had the DAG from the last chapter, but with the DAG from the last chapter, you're assuming that the two groups are not influencing each other after treatment. So I think it's a great, very clear example of how you use difference and differences with this situation. But yeah, it is surprising because you wouldn't really be able to tease out the result otherwise. Let's see. He does talk about after that. He does talk about how to try and figure out better uncertainty or standard error, and he just goes through like you can with the sample units you can do replacement with bootstrapping. You can kind of aggregate the time data, like ignoring the time series, you just average over one time period to try and collapse the whole situation into this basic 2x2 situation. And then he also mentioned clustering, which is, I guess, embedded in different softwares that people use. But it works if there are a lot of clusters, but not great if there are only a small number of clusters that you can work with. And then, yeah. So then I think he then talks about how to, I don't know, bolster the claim that there are parallel trends. Goes to like an Affordable Care Act example. Basically, there was, before this study came out, and this study came out in 2019, there were indications that increased expansion of Affordable Care Act and Medicaid's expansion, that it didn't help with population mortality. And so he put together 4 different event studies as a means to kind of demonstrate, well, as a means to study, and then it demonstrated a pretty significant change in population mortality. But initially, it just looked at like Medicaid's eligibility change. So you had before the event time, obviously there is an eligibility, or it's a mean to 0, and then this is the effect of people becoming eligible after the event time, which makes sense. And then and then the second graph shows people actually having coverage. So there was there was a bit of a lag, but it's also obviously very much like, seems very visually compelling that, they became eligible, then they actually signed up for coverage. And then the next one shows, the change there was a pretty significant drop or decrease in people who are uninsured. And then the final one is a annual mortality. So they compared all these things to this event and then changes in mortality. And well, the errors are still close to 0, that they are significant. And this actually translates to like a drop in about over 9% drop in mortality. And so you can kind of clearly show that there was a specific event that occurred, and then before and after that, there are very clear indications from this kind of difference and case event study that you can kind of causally infer that the expanded Medicaid did decrease mortality. And then they actually had the individual records, so they were able to go back and tie in who had actually adopted Medicaid, and then their mortality compared to other previous before the event, sort of thing. For event studies. So, and then kind of then goes on and then talks about placebos in difference in diff. And this is basically trying to include an additional control. So like with the Pennsylvania and New Jersey situation, you have they're comparing. They then try to split it into low wage workers and high wage workers. So you have with initially, since you don't have randomized examples, you are using groups that are most likely, that have a likely common trend with each other. And so you're trying to include a third, or instead of one control group, having a second control group. In this case, they're looking at high wage workers, and their idea was that since the minimum wage, increase in the minimum wage would affect people who are working minimum wage jobs, and then this should not have an impact on high wage workers. So you can use high wage workers as an additional control to try and control, to try and control for different trends and different unobserved variables. So if we look at the example, it's like, if you kind of then look at the triple different, this is a difference in difference result. And then I believe, let's see, difference, I see. I think it definitely shows that there is an effect, but it doesn't look like I was always kind of a little confused about the triple differences. I understand kind of conceptually why you would want to use it as a kind of like an additional sort of validation for why this would work, and to show that there is an effect, but it doesn't really appear to increase, like it doesn't seem to reduce the uncertainty or the standard errors. It doesn't, and it seems to it can seem to kind of complicate the issue in later examples, but I'm not exactly sure why, but like I don't know. Does anybody have any thoughts on like why you'd want to use triple differences? It does seem to, like, if you're trying to convince somebody of your results, it seems more like a more robust result, but you're also kind of including more complexity in your model. So I'm not exactly sure on the exact idea. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Oh, that
Yeah.
makes sense.
So, hey everyone, Rahul here. So, like in the previous example that you were showing about the insurance and those kind of things, right? Um, Comparing the two different neighboring states, one which had the Medicaid, one which didn't. So, differences in that case, like the three difference in that case would mean comparing people from the same state, who didn't have Medicaid compared to those who did, because that will allow you to control for things like if there was a hurricane in one state and people died despite of having more insurance coverage, right? So it can control for non-parallel trends in that case. That makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. It's the additional difference is making there are multiple trends than that than adding an additional difference. Well, it makes sense. You have an additional difference, an additional control, then that also controls for a higher state of higher dimensionality of issues, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, this is based the difference based that based on the fact that, like, trends are going to be parallel, but
Mm.
what if there is something else also confounding that parallel trend, like if there was a hurricane in one state and people died, like despite getting Medicaid, right? Like you need to be able to control for that thing, and that can be only done if you're comparing other people in the same state with the ones who actually had Medicaid. Yes. Right. So that's that. One question I have is, so like I have gone through all the chapters, and a lot of things are in my mind when I'm, let's say, trying to figure out what exact model or what way should I be adhering to when designing a causal study, for example. So like one thing I was confusing this was with the matching chapter, the very first one. Like, why aren't we just finding the similar uh, representative people in other states based on their demographics, and then comparing it, like, pre and post kind of thing, before and after treatment? And why are we going with this difference in difference and not just matching people? um, like, does anyone have an idea of why should we go with this design and not simply matching people and computing the pre and post?
I think I can elaborate here. Oh,
Oh,
go ahead,
I was gonna
Khalil.
say, is it because it affects everybody in the state? It's not like a subpopulation in the state in one state versus a subpopulation in another state, right? So you're kind of matching states in a way, not matching the population that's treated.
But it can be done through matching then, right? Like if I were to match people in, let's say, New Jersey with having the same demographics with people in Pennsylvania, um, and trying to see, like, you know, there would be people in New Jersey who got, let's say, Medicaid, and people in Pennsylvania who didn't.
That
Uh,
It's interesting. Maybe then in a way that's what you're doing when you do the low salary people
yeah,
compared to the
right.
higher salary. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
You are using a smaller population, so I don't know how that would affect. Um, I mean, I don't know how that would affect your standard errors. Um, since you're working with a smaller population of people, using kind of including matching as well. But
I think one case, Rahul, is we don't actually know who is each individual person. So if remember in the chapter 4, I think it was chapter 4, where they were matching, it was supposed to be the same person that was being matched, whether they got chemotherapy or the other treatment that I'm not forgetting. I think just chemotherapy or surgery or whatever it was. But in this case, we just have the groups of people, and there's no like. I wouldn't know how we would do propensity score matching in this case because there isn't even there aren't like the covariates to make for propensity scoring. Now again, not being an expert in this, I'll just say I've, at least for my work, I've seen much more folks do difference in differences with groups than I have ever seen individual matching of outcomes. And this is at the big tech scale. So I think it has to do with if you can't match user to user for whatever reason or individual to individual, then you do a difference in differences. Does that help?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we are looking at groups here and not individuals per se. So yeah, then that helps. Okay, thank you.
so just with the next example he gives is I thought it was a very interesting study. It was about legalized abortion and then long-term gonorrhea incidents, and the it's kind of a I'm trying to remember it's kind of uh, the predictions that they made from seemed very shocking in that how trying to tie like legalized abortion and how that affects gonorrhea incidents. Um, so they basically these are 15 to 19-year-old populations after abortion was legalized, and there's a kind of significant drop in that population, and that was what they were able to use the differences to predict um, this drop, and so that's kind of shocking, and to be able to kind of work with this this effect, and so and it seems pretty significant. I'm kind of blanking on the details of it right now, but if anybody wants to mention anything, they can. But and then they did the I see. They also did a triple differences. Sorry, my dog's drinking water right now. But the you still see an effect, but I think when they this is what I was curious about when using the triple differences. It seems like this seems like a very compelling graph, right? You get a pretty distinct change that occurs right when you expect it to. And then when you do a triple differences, you're including 25 to 29-year-olds as an additional control, and the effect becomes. I mean, like I'm not trying. You're trying to look to see if there is an effect or not, and so this, I think it's an important way to kind of examine the data, but it becomes less compelling. And I wonder if that's because, I mean, is it an issue of there being an effect or not an effect, or is there an issue because you're confounding, you're having I don't know, in an attempt to control for the effect, to add an additional control, you also seem to be making it more complicated or less clear. And you're making additional assumptions. You're assuming that 19-year-olds and 25-year-olds are not interacting with each other, and that may or may not be true. So I guess that's the additional. In an attempt to kind of like have an additional control, you're also including additional assumptions. So I'm curious, and I'm not sure how effective it is. but if it works, it seems more robust. And then let's see. And then when he goes, this is after he publishes his paper in 2013. They tried to repeat the same thing, but with a different age group. And like in this, I found it interesting that with 20 to 24-year-olds, you have the same kind of pattern that you had in the 15 to 19-year-olds. In this initial one. And so he was assuming that 20-year-olds and 19-year-olds were not interacting with each other, which I think is what invalidates this, or at least draws into question whether this is an effective, impact or not. It's like he kind of, in this part of the chapter, he talks about how like he was hoping to do 20 to 24-year-olds and then have a similar pattern where their effective date would come during this, when the treatment kind of passed through the 20 to 24-year-olds, and so that would kind of show that it's a kind of robust effect across age groups. And I think it's complicated by the fact that 15 to 19-year-olds, well, I don't know. In my mind, I kind of tend to think of endogenous and exogenous from kind of an ecological standpoint. I think those are where the terms come from, but I don't know, if you think of like a source, if like there's like more of a source of gonorrhea in the younger group, then that effect might have a larger impact on other groups as well in interaction. But I think in general, the whole problem with these situations is that invalidates the groups not interacting with each other. So while he kind of uses this example as like decreasing the validity of their initial experiment from 2013, I'm not sure if it says either. It just seems inconclusive to me. But I don't know what your thoughts are.
So admittedly, since there were 3 graphs and multiple testable hypotheses, I also lost track of exactly which hypothesis was supposed to prove what. But I like this example for a different reason in this book.
Okay.
I enjoyed it because it was good that he set it up and then he goes through to show. And I think that actually was quite nice of him as an author to show an example where he published a paper and then his paper ended up, I don't want to say being wrong, but his original hypothesis was not like replicated when they dug into it more. And to your point, like you said, the first graph looked very convincing that there was going to be a big difference between the incidence of gonorrhea and abortion, but then that falls apart. And in particular, there was one paragraph towards the end of the section where he talks about reasons why that might end up being the case. So I'm reading this off the book, but imagine for a moment a parabola showed up for all age groups precisely in the years they predicted the theory, right? So he takes the time to explain that this difference in differences does assume some linearity and like you said, parallel paths assumption, and if this effect ends up being parabolic, it'll look good for one portion of the data until you get past the peak, and then it'll look different. So more than anything, I think I just appreciated him going through an example and showing us how it eventually could fail. Especially because in the rest of the book, he this is good, but he shows the examples that are largely successful. So it was nice to get a case for himself where he shows where things may not work out so well.
I do like this. I think it goes to the rest of the chapter as well, especially when you're going into the later sections. Kind of like there were a lot of papers that were published using diff and diff, and then they kind of like then they kind of like went back and like realized that there were issues with when you extrapolate diff and diff to more complicated situations, and then all these papers that were published in around this time period kind of like were shown to have kind of significant issues with them, or switching in signs and effect of what you're trying to measure. But yeah, I do like that. Kind of points out that there is less evidence for what kind of initially looked quite convincing. Oops, let's see. All right. This next section he goes through kind of critique of mythology, using placebos as critique, which I thought was a kind of a great idea. He gives the example of using the rational addiction model, and so they weren't trying to well, basically they used the exact same model and like tried to predict how addictive milk was or eggs were, and like the model predicted that the eggs were or milk was extremely addictive. So that seems like a nonsensical model, and so the criticism was not of the underlying theory, but just how you implement the models, makes a big difference. And using a placebo is a great way to kind of check to whether your models are actually kind of putting out what you'd expect them to. Let's see. And then another issue was there was a also from about 2013 they were trying to they're looking at music expenditure and internet use, and in June of 1999, Napster came out. So they're trying to, if you look at among these groups, there is a drop in buying recorded music in entertainment. And so his point was that using repeated cross sections and then trying to draw an inference as to what caused the drop. If there's also changes in composition, like changes in wage, which happens, there is a change in wage, there's a change in age group, change kind of in ages during this time period, that there could be lots of other causes for a drop in music use, and not just trying, and you aren't really able to tie it to the occurrence of Napster. So just kind of like additional things that you need to consider when trying to design these different situations. So, and then finally moving on to the two-way fixed effects with differential timing. So like in a lot of kind of more real world examples, you have multiple groups and you have multiple time periods that these groups are treated. And so trying to take the original kind of 2x2 idea and then extrapolating it to more complicated situations. When you do the algebra, when you do the derivation, what you end up getting is you have 4 groups that all kind of have a weighted average to kind of create the overall treatment. And so, the early group versus untreated group makes a lot of sense. That's just the general, you still have a control. And then the late group versus untreated group, you also have a control. And then early versus late, you still have, this is like not a control, but it's not yet treated, so it might as well be a control. And then the issue becomes the impact of having to use the late treated group versus the early treated group that already has a treatment effect on it, and you no longer have a control available. And so that's kind of where I think those other papers that he mentioned in the chapter kind of start to come in, have an issue. And I think I have, let's see, so basically in order for those 4 things have to come together, you basically have, they're basically weighted, they're variance weighted, each of the 4 kind of impacts. And then the common trends also is also variance weighted, and it's actually slightly less restrictive than parallel trends, because either this has to go to 0 or if there is a strict parallel trends, then it will go to 0, but there are also due to the weighting, it can go to 0 in other circumstances. But the issue is when you go from the standard 2x2 to more complicated situations with multiple groups, is that there kind of just in the real world, there is heterogeneity within the time bias. So like within a group, after it's been treated, there can be lag. So you can like cause a treatment, and then it takes a while for the treatment to come to full effect. And so that can change the slope of your average for already treated group. Or if there is just a variation or an increase, if the treated group is not in a stable state, then when you take the final comparison and you compare the treated group to the already treated group, this is no longer acting as a control. And so you then get a bias in your attempt to try and measure the treatment of the last group. So like, and so that is, I think, I'm trying to remember if that was in this book or if it was in another book. There was a great graph of like, as you kind of ramp up treatment, that when you're trying to average over that whole time period, you don't get, unless the treatment like instantly takes effect and then doesn't change ever during that time period. If there's a lag, which is pretty common, or if there's a drop off, then your estimate that you're trying to use as control completely will reverse the sign of what you think is being treated from this last group, and then that kind of goes into the Bacon decomposition, but we'll go to that later. This is another example of the Castle Doctrine statutes and homicides, and which is just kind of another great example of just suppose using this design and then developing kind of a very strong narrative that shows kind of not necessarily intuitive or either intuitive or not intuitive, but kind of a logical progression as to what happens. In this situation, it was changes in when you can use personal defense, I guess, as opposed to just in your house, but anywhere. And they're able to kind of like never treat states, and then they're able to do this with Florida, and obviously there's a pretty substantial kind of increase, and then it kind of, so there's a pretty substantial increase at this treatment period that comes up, and then it's interesting that there's a kind of falls after the initial kind of treatment in place, I guess, it follows the kind of similar trend as the other states, but it's at a higher time period. And then there was an example of just going through and doing the same thing with different data. And then this is the Bacon decomposition. So the issues are like the late group versus early group comparison. So the treated versus never treated are pretty significant. And so I guess, right, this graph shows kind of to the right shows how much contribution the four sums are, and then where they are in their estimate. So the late group versus early group has less of a weight to it, but it does shift. They do kind of shift where the overall treatment estimate is, and then but they're seeing like the treated versus never treated is definitely kind of weighted more, so that that gives a better influence. But it can shift kind of your overall treatment estimate. I'm not sure if that's okay. Already there, but does that make sense, or is that kind of following? Because there were quite a few papers, and I'm trying to remember which ones they were now, but they initially didn't see much of a treatment effect, because with this bias, it will give a lower estimate. It kind of biases towards zero, so it will give a lower estimate of the treatment versus what you'd actually expect from if you didn't have this complication of a time varying treatment effect. And then there also are some good, just kind of like trying to figure out how to take difference and differences moving forward. And so there's a good paper, Callaway and Santana. They try to figure out a different way. They do more of a stepwise analysis to try and convert these complicated situations and decompose them into strict 2x2 situations. And that by doing that, they're able to avoid this bias towards zero, because they're avoiding using the last treatment. They avoid using late treated versus early treated groups. But yeah, that's about it. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts or that sort of thing?
Hi guys.
Hey.
Yeah, what I noticed is that many influential papers were published quite recently, right? Which maybe indicates a problematic relationship with this method. because it exists for so long. And yeah, in the last years, we saw a lot of papers, which is also what Scott was pointing out.
Yeah, it was interesting. Like a lot of the like Scott's paper and a couple of the other papers are from 2013, and then a lot of these more recent papers from like with Goodman Bacon from 2019 and so forth. They're kind of pointing out the issues of different, kind of the more complicated diff scenarios, and trying to like it's an actively kind of researched area where they're trying to figure out ways to kind of solve this bias kind of situation. Let's see. I think. Oh, how's this? Oh, never mind. But I don't know. I thought it was very interesting. I thought the chapters was. I was surprised at how like powerful diff and diff is, kind of just in its basic state. And let's see. I think I might stop sharing my screen really quick and just. Oh, there we go. So, I think that is kind of just the overview of the chapter. Are people using diff and diff, or are there any examples, kind of like of how people would use this, like examples, or does anybody have any thoughts on any more thoughts on the chapter, or was it pretty straightforward? Did people have an issue? Kind of, were there any like parts in the chapter were kind of a little more difficult to figure out or understand? I mean, I'm not an expert by any means. I'm just trying to think about through the chapter and understand how things are going.
Well, one thing is when you said you wanted to do this chapter, I'll have to admit a little bit of me was a little excited because it's such a long, especially after panel data, it's such a long chapter. A lot of the other chapters were I'd say they were fairly straightforward, especially the last, well, panel data for sure. And then I think the last ones before that, right? There was just like one or two methods, and then it would go into a case study. It wasn't too bad. This chapter had like 7 or 8 or 9, and then models and things going on from the basic diff and diff, like you said, to triple differences to then the biases and whatnot. So it was a fairly, I mean, just by pages, you can tell this seems to be one of the more used things. I also just have heard about regression discontinuity. Not regression discontinuity. Difference and differences much more in my line of work. So I think I'm gonna have to do another 2 or 3 read-throughs of this chapter to try and figure out exactly all the nuances of it. Because the initial part of diff and diff isn't too bad, right? You have one group, you make an assumption of parallel paths, and then you have another group, and they get a treatment. But then all of these variations on top of it, and reformulations and linear regressions, I gotta piece it all together in my head. So I'm glad you did it in the slideshow, because I don't think I could have done a better job on this chapter. You did fantastic pulling out all the correct information.
I like the causal inference for the brave and true. Like it has the first section is just about the basic diff and diff, but the second section helps to kind of like, I found that helpful to kind of read through, and I think that's where the graph is showing the kind of the changes in treatment effect, and that was helpful. And then there are also videos going over the different. It was nice having the authors go through their own papers, and that's kind of helpful and useful.
Annie in the chat asks, any thoughts on doing diff and diff with just averages instead of regression? You don't get the standard error for a fast pass. Calculating the averages for a large group is much easier and intuitive for end users. For my end, I've actually, most of the diff and diff examples that I've seen in my line of work have been some sort of point estimate of a group, so the averages and things like that. So I'm not having derived anything because this book is full of derivations. I assume a regression is just an average with a covariate and whatnot. So I think it would. I mean, it would. Okay, the average, just plain averages without covariates, I know works, and I think adding covariates just adds the extra flavor of controlling for some other co-founder, which is what regressions do, as we saw in the second chapter. So I think, Andy, the answer is yes. I do think different diffs can simplify to just averages without covariance. But
yeah, and I think
of course,
it makes it it's easier to explain, but you just don't have the standard errors associated with it, so it becomes
Yeah, thanks, Chad. First and foremost, it was really nice. I personally think a lot comes to it of getting familiar with the method, so that, like, assuming you are in academia, you have to be very familiar with your methods, right? And also, like, be open about your assumptions, because I think a lot of people, they are kind of afraid to be open about the assumption, because something they get a lot of critiques. And yeah, but I can think that in a professional setting, like in industry, you can actually use this more easily. Yeah, I think it's a very powerful method.
Hello. One thing to add on top of what you said, like the assumption part, right? So at my work, I have this causal study thing where we are trying to discern the impact of certain email ad campaigns on people. But for that, people first need to sign up for, like, they are willing to, accept or like see those ads kind of thing. So I was like initially confused between diff and diff versus matching. Uh, but then there is this one line there that the assignment, like the treatment itself, should not be endogenous when it comes to diff and diff. That is, people should not be, having the freedom to whether they want to be selected for the ad or not. And that's what makes it different than the matching case studies, because there you just match people based on their demographics or whatnot, and then you compute the control for the treated group. Whereas in diff and diff, it's not up to the people to actually fall into one of those buckets. Like, it's up to the experimenter to do that, and that's where there's the difference between these two approaches. Yes.
interesting. DM Burt in the chat also says, I do health policy analyses, and diff and diff is one of our bread and butter methods. Taking a full causal approach is important. Backdoor paths where bad controls threaten to mess up our interactions very often. Threaten to mess up our inferences very often.
yeah. So I think it's I found the whole chapter very interesting, and it seems like there's a pretty complicated thing to kind of go through again. Is there I don't know, just if anybody has any feedback as well on this format of doing a Zoom call and having a discussion, we could do that in discourse or in the discourse or whatever, or and also if you have any, if everyone has any ideas about another book to do, that would be good too.
Yeah, I want to second Chad on that one. First off, everyone should definitely thank Chad for putting this together. Even prior to you folks logging on, Chad was starting Zoom and ending Zoom and starting Zoom, trying to get all these settings working. I apologize even for a little bit at the beginning where you couldn't hear my audio, but we got it all figured out. So the big point is, if you felt like there was a big difference, pun intended, with doing the book club this way, let us know. Let everybody know in discourse, and we can smooth it out and make it easier. Perhaps somebody else would want to host on a more interactive format like this. Like Chad helped us experiment, and then we just have one more chapter left, actually, unless we count the conclusion. So go ahead and read that chapter. I will wait for folks to let us know what format they want, because then with the format we'll know when folks are available. And then think ahead if you would like to do this again with another book and what that book may be. The only I don't want to push this any two ways, but the things that I can think of in my head are potentially we could go one way that's very programming related, so not like a beginners of Python book, but some sort of book with programming, or continue on in stats, causal inference, the mathematical world. So, give us your thoughts. Diembert says the series has popped up in the YouTube feed and it's been absolutely amazing, loving it. So I think, well, it seems like the four of you logged on and it's been around every other Sunday. So I would, and it lines up with the new year. So it seems like we should keep this going. So let us know what the best way is. How. Lars, it feels like you want to say something. Yep. Sorry, Lars, it feels like you want to say something, so I want to let you go ahead.
What I also, because you mentioned the programming, there was actually a section from Scott Cunningham's book where he says that a lot of researchers are kind of limited in their maybe programming skills towards Python or R. And they use Starter, and Starter does not have like the rich toolkit we have with R and Python, and so this limits a lot of research, which is interesting, right? Because it's a mathematical barrier there.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, when I was first studying statistics, I had to use these things called Minitab or SPSS. And those were extremely limiting for me at the time as well. Using a full programming language has been one of the best individual skills that I've gained in my career. So.
And I also feel that the book was really nice because it was very balanced from the technical part, and it had a lot of examples. So, yeah, maybe. To find a book which fits in this part is maybe difficult, but maybe we also go a bit more into the application maybe and programming stuff. I don't know. You should ask the community later.
Yeah, I'll try and throw some suggestions out there to see the discussion, but I think the things that will matter, now we're having a second discussion. The things that will matter is one, the first one will be open access. So the reason open access will be good is so everybody can participate and they don't have to buy an expensive test book. It also makes it a little bit easier because if we share pictures and stuff, we don't have to worry about copyrights and lawyers yelling at us. So ideally open access, and then like you said, Lars, a mix between applied and academia. I think that fits this format fairly well. It would be tough to have a book that is extremely just academic and mathy for this club, because we would all on the Sundays be falling. It'd be tough. So I agree with those sentiments. Okay, I'll start a thread in the discourse forum. One other question I'll have for you folks, you can just ping me, is whether you would like more emails from me. So I don't want to spam folks' inboxes too much with too many emails, but I also recognize sometimes people mix things up. So let me know what your email preferences are, and we'll keep this going. Cool.
Sounds good.
Yeah, sounds good.
Great.
Do you have any books in mind, Robin, which maybe I would like?
Maybe
I would. Go ahead, Rahul.
So I was thinking like maybe we can do that double ML chapter from the Causal Inference for the Brave and Bold. Because that's something that keeps popping up every now and then, that double machine learning. I don't know
So-
whether anyone has seen it.
So this was actually, we're gonna a lot of discussion today. There's another thing we could do, which is we could continue with the causal inference and not go through like an entire book, but there's also the effect, like causal inference for the brave and true. And if you folks haven't seen, Chad compiled a ton of resources on different diff in the discourse. I'm actually going to be referring to his posts quite often because there's so many posts. We could do a couple of sample chapters from other causal inference books to wrap up causal inference before moving on to the next one. So, there's a lot of options, but we'll certainly keep the momentum going. I think at this point I wouldn't want to not do a book club. This has been quite nice. Cool. There's a couple things came in from the chat. Annie says on the programming side that she started with SPSS, went to R, and then Python, and then DM Bert says the same thing. He followed the same path, with a stop at SAS, in which Annie says she looked at SAS and then walked away. So I think the other common theme here is we want everybody here wants a book that doesn't have some proprietary software. They have some Python, at least definitely Python or R component to it. So we'll keep that in mind as well. We won't force anybody to learn Minitab or SPSS or SAS or anything like that. All right, I think we hit the hour mark there. And any closing remarks from anybody, both either in the Zoom call or in the chat? None. All right. Well, at least for the Americans, I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving. Whoever is celebrating that, and then Christmas is a little bit broader. So for everybody that's going to celebrate Christmas, although we probably will have one book club in December. So I'll post this is the important thing. I'll post the date for the next live stream in the discourse as well. December might be tricky, but if not, we'll do it in January. So, and close out this particular book. All right. I'm going to end the live stream then. I have control over that. I don't have control over the Zoom though, so that's going to be on Chad when he kicks everybody out of the Zoom. So, thank you everybody again for this new format. Triple thanks. I'll say 3 thanks because of the difference that Chad has made by trying by working with this new format, and appreciate you all and see you sometime soon.